Hello, my name is Jasmine Webb. I am a current PhD student at Liberty University. I have a bachelor's in history, a master's in writing, a second master's in education with a focus on history, and I'm currently in my 7th year of teaching at the secondary level education. My project is over knighthood and the way knights in general were understood both by modern researchers as well as by themselves and those not in the lifestyle of knights that knights led. My key research question is basically how were they viewed in their time, more specifically. I do mention a little bit with the more modern historiography, but for the most part, I stuck to how specifically knights, specifically themselves, really looked at each other and how they interpreted their codes of chivalry, how they interpreted the term knighthood, what it was to be a knight, as well as those outside of the knighthood lifestyle looking in. So I looked at clergy, laymen, soldiers, all of that. Some of my types of evidence, I really relied heavily on primary. Specifically, I looked at Geoffrey de Charny's A Knight's Own Book of Chivalry. Throughout the paper, I regularly call back to him and different parts of what he talks about because he's extremely specific with his ranking system, I suppose you could call it, of what is most, worthy of praise versus what's not as worthy of praise. And even some of the things he purposely leaves out, I think are very telling. Other things that I relied on, I looked at Richard Barber, Niger Saul, and Savage. Those are a few of my secondary sources. But for the most part, I was looking at Charny, I was looking at Froissart, a French knight who describes the Great Schism in great detail, as well as parts of the Crusades. And I know I pulled directly from one of his descriptions of trial by combat, which was very fascinating. I also looked into some of their burial practices, some of the religious commentaries on knighthood. I looked at some of their poetry and fiction. So that was more where my argument was coming from with what the laymen kind of tended to think of. But also a lot of the knights themselves were creating this poetry and these fiction stories. And so it was interesting to see how they viewed themselves. For the most part, I did find that similar to the historiography that we first started uncovering, knights in general had a very romantic view of themselves. They were very pious individuals. They were very specific on pushing the religious portion of their lifestyle. That is a major part of my paper, just talking about how religion affects what the knights were doing, how they were living their lives. And so all of that kind of came together and it was just really fascinating. What I did discover was essentially religion and knighthood were completely intertwined. You can't have one without the other, in my opinion. The code of chivalry was developed off of the Christian lifestyle. It came from the Normans. It was a focal part of them becoming knights. It was, how they led everything. Some of them did get a little more loose with their interpretations, but even then they carried on with that code, and there was a very strict social consequence if they did not, because most of them were part of nobility themselves, and so really interesting stuff. When I'm looking at further study, I was fascinated with a couple things. I wanted to look more in depth on how a knight was knighted. De Charny talks about the knighthood process, and I just found that so fascinating. I also want to know, I didn't really touch on what happened if a knight broke their code of chivalry. So I think that's probably going to be my next thing that I kind of start looking into. And I'm also interested in the westernization process that occurred throughout history. And we have the term, chivalrous behavior today. And so I'm curious to know, what sort of influence did knights and their codes of chivalry and all of that have on modern day, law and everything. And or even just cultural practices, not even needing to look into law as much, but those are kind of where I'm going to be headed. So overall, fascinating information. I hope you enjoy it, and let me know if you have any questions.